Hello, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really delighted to be introducing today's event for you. My name is Neda Zuhdi, and I'm the director of the Opengov Hub. And we are gathered here today for a really timely and important conversation. So the Opengov Hub is a meeting place in downtown DC, which supports a network of about 50 organizations who are working to help open up governments and empower citizens all around the world. And two of our panelists today come from our member organizations. But our network is really based on these three shared values of transparency, accountability, and civic engagement. And clearly, we're living in a really important moment right now to talk about all three of those things. About transparency, accountability, and civic participation as it relates to policing and criminal justice, but also to longstanding racial injustice more broadly. So to give you a bit of context, like many others, the Opengov Hub made a statement earlier this month in the wake of the death of George Floyd and many others, and many of our members did this as well. But as part of our particular commitment to do more on this issue, we know we need to listen more and learn from others who have far more expertise on this topic. So our role at the Hub is really focused on convening. Over the last several years, we've convened different perspectives on so many different critical public policy issues of our day, both international issues and domestic issues, through the events that we organize and our programs. So we continue that tradition today by bringing these diverse perspectives into one shared conversation. And I want to acknowledge up front that there may be a wide range of opinions of all of us in the room on this topic. So given that, I'd like to offer just three guiding principles for how we can spend the next hour together. The first is to offer mutual respect for everyone in this space and agree to disagree if needed. The second is to really lean into difficult and uncomfortable conversations because that's often when we learn and grow the most. And the third is really to bring an open mind and strive to learn something new on this topic, no matter where we might stand. So thank you all so much for showing up today to learn and engage together in this important shared work, because we know the magnitude of racial injustices in this country is far too great for any one of us to be solving alone. One housekeeping note before we get started is to please use the chat box if you like to introduce yourself and to share comments. But use the question and answer, the Q&A box, to ask questions of the speakers at any time. You can also upvote questions that you see in the Q&A box from others. And we will run two polls during the event that we encourage you to participate in as well. So with that, I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Keisha Middlemass, who's our moderator. She brings a wealth of expertise to this topic and will guide today's conversation. Dr. Middlemass is a professor of political science at Howard University. She teaches courses in public policy and American politics, conducts research on race, institutions, and marginalized populations. And she's the author of the book Convicted and Condemned, and co-author of the book Racializing Justice, Disenfranchising Lives. So with that, Keisha, I'm happy to hand it over.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about this group of panelists. They have a wealth of experience and perspectives, which is really important in this dialogue. So I just want to reinforce the opening is we want to listen, we want to engage, we want to be respectful, and that agreeing to disagree is perfectly acceptable, but until you disagree, please listen. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our panelists. So Carlton Wilhout is an officer with the Metropolitan Police Department in DC. He specializes in community outreach and crisis intervention. He was the community coordinator at Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth in Hong Kong and holds a degree from Lincoln University, a historically Black university in Pennsylvania. You may have seen Carlton in pictures in the Washington Post because he took a knee with one of the protesters, and that has been shared widely on social media. We also have with us Rebecca Schaefer. She's the legal director at Fair Trials, which is a leading organization dealing with advocacy and policy work in North America and South American countries. She is a research fellow, or has been a research fellow at the Human Rights Watch, and has worked in many countries, including Ecuador, Guatemala, South Africa, Zambia, and Egypt, as well as the United States. She earned her Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University. We have with us, Atiba Madian. He is the president and CEO of the Madian Group. It's a government relations firm, and he is also the founder of Party Politics US. This is an exciting firm because it engages with American voters, but really focuses on young people to get them to talk about, discuss, and engage around politics, elections, and public policy. He's a former director of the National Black Caucus of State Legislators, and he is an expert in political strategy, communications, and community organizing. He's a graduate of Virginia State University. And last but not least is Carrie Fulton. She's an award-winning environmental and criminal justice advocate, organizer, writer, and cultural historian. She has coordinated various domestic and global coalitions, including Power Shift, which is the largest youth climate summit in the United States. And in 2017, she was a leader in the National People's Climate March. She is a 2020 National Urban Fellow, a current policy fellow with the Climate Justice Alliance, and is a graduate of Howard University and Georgetown University. So without further ado, I would like to thank all our panelists here, and I would like to open it up for the first question. Carlton, I'm going to lead off with you. So when you hear as an officer defunding or abolishing the police, what does that mean to you personally, but also what does it mean from the police perspective?
First, I'm sorry. First, I'd like to tackle from like the police perspective, because my counterparts and everything like that. I feel like when the phrase defund comes about, it's automatic fear, because the word defund in itself, if you just go by Webster, it's to take away, to eradicate. So when my counterparts hear that, they feel fear, because it's basically their livelihoods, an occupation where they dedicate their lives to, but all of a sudden it's going to be dismantled. And when I heard, from my perspective, when I heard defund the police, I was at first confused, because I have a lot of friends in my network who are on both sides of things. And so I see a lot of things on social media, or if people call me if they just have questions or we're just talking. And I see that some people's like, Will Hoyt, man, I love you, but we need to get rid of this system. And then I had others like, yeah, defund the police. Let's take some of these resources away from this huge entity that's, through history and currently are kind of like not doing what they're supposed to do, and let's kind of use those resources to build a better network amongst the community. And to me, defunding is pretty much, for me, that idea of allocating those resources. So if we're just spending money on like new cell phones or something like that, taking that money and actually putting it into the community. So.
Got it. Thank you. Atiba, would you like to follow up either from a political perspective about what defunding the police can mean?
What it can mean or what it does mean, I think.
Both?
Yeah, I think a lot of this keeps going back to the messaging. But I think that initially I thought that the name was a little bit off base, but the more that we are talking about this, the more I think that it is the right word. We really do need to address how we're, for instance, right here in DC, funding a police department with a $550 million budget, and every year asking for more money, yet every year we continue to see homicides increase in certain parts of the city. Some of this, in my opinion, is tied to gentrification. It's a conversation a lot of us don't want to have, because if you have a poor, blighted neighborhood, it gives a reason to continue to try to push those people that are in those neighborhoods out in order to reinvest in them. So I think the bigger question is, how are we investing, and how are our leaders looking at what I believe is our number one resource, and that's humans. How are we treating each other? I think what we keep seeing across the country and around the world is this recognition that Africans, people of color, have been dehumanized for a long time. And you can see this in example in terms of how dollars are allocated. Too many times we're hearing and seeing these stories of, I can't breathe, or every day I'm on my Facebook pages, I'm sharing more stories. And, you know, some people are saying, wow, it's a lot. Yes, this is a lot. These are the things that African Americans have experienced for a long time. The issues that we've been saying that were issues with the police departments are issues that we've been saying for a long time. I mean, just yesterday, Fairfax County issued a report. The day before, PG County issued a report. I'm a 48-year-old born and raised resident of Washington, D.C., who remembers and recalls these stories of, you know, and our awareness as teenagers of driving into areas like PG County. So these reports, yes, we welcome the reports that are coming out now, but these are things that we have been talking about long before I was born. And so when we talk about these issues of defunding the police, I think it really is, we've got to look and think outside the box, one. And I even think we need to be looking at how we're disbanding the departments and rehiring people into the departments, because we have white supremacists that are throughout this department. Right here in Washington, D.C., which used to be recognized as Chocolate City, we know that there have been police officers that have gone up, put up signs, worn T-shirts in court, in criminal proceedings. So the conversations that are coming out are hard conversations, but policing goes back to slave patrols and slavery. And if we want to address the issues of systemic racism, we cannot shy away from talking about slavery and its origins in America and how all of this is tied together.
Excellent. Thank you. Carrie, I saw you respond with your hand. Please jump in.
Thank you. One, I want to thank the two gentlemen for their comments prior to me, and thank y'all for having me to join you all for this conversation, which is super critical. Atiba, super awesome because that's my brother's name. So there you go. But I've been reflecting a lot, and I've been in a lot of tears, and I don't work on criminal justice, I work on climate justice, which is very much intertwined, more so than people realize. And I've been in a lot of tears this morning because I grew up in Denver. My family, as we think about migration patterns and how we move as Black people and how we've been forced to move because of patrols. You know, when we think about those slave patrols, when we think about Black codes, when we think about criminal justice during the times of Jim Crow and how we moved and migrated up north, and then how we've moved and migrated across the country. And now how we're moving and migrating due to gentrification, and how more of our populations are moving into suburbs where our populations might not have as much power. And I'm thinking a lot about that from growing up in Denver. And my heart is with the family of Elijah McClain, who was murdered by the Aurora Police Department, which is a suburb of Denver where a lot of Black folk have moved to as Denver has gentrified. Much like PG, as DC changed and grew and expanded, more of us moved to the suburbs. And if you go to his words from the footage, you know, and they always talk about people, oh, well, he shouldn't have been doing this. Why did he do that? You know, why did he run? He didn't do any of those things. And I just got to read it, because I think one of the biggest things that's important when we talk about defunding police is that the more that you put money into funding police, the less money goes into mental health resources. And a lot of these issues that happen in our communities are because of mental health issues. And a lot of those mental health issues are directly related to lead in our water, are directly related to stresses from climate change, are directly related to the stresses of having to move and not having economic safety and safety nets being broken down. And those safety nets are broken down so that we can create more funding for police. And another reflection that I put in on that is that growing up in Denver, we didn't have a large Black population like you see here in DC. But when I moved to DC in 2003, that was one of the main critical pieces that made me feel safe, was that the police officers look like me. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are exempt from police brutality or injustice, but just the simple fact that someone who is supposed to protect me looks like me and is not going to judge me based off of the fact that I have on a head wrap, or based on the fact that I'm Black, you know, or based on the fact of how I'm walking, that's so critical. And we have seen that change that Atiba mentioned. We are seeing more conservative cops coming into DC. We are seeing more white cops as the space gentrifies, and we are seeing more white supremacists, and we have to talk about that. So thank you.
Yes, perfect. No. Your comments lead into thinking about the legal perspective and the law and what have you. So Rebecca, could you please chime in on the legal perspective of this moment in time?
Yeah, I mean, I actually want to pick up on a lot of things that Carrie was saying, because it is about shifting our focus, restarting a conversation about what safety means to us, what brings us security in communities, and thinking about that more holistically than just a reflexive turn to a police state, a police approach. There's definitely legal changes that need to happen in terms of accountability for police who violate laws and norms. You know, and I can rattle them off, and you all probably know them: abolition of qualified immunity, use of force standards, changes to union and city contracts, increased accountability and transparency for police violence, and other kinds of behavioral problems. But none of those things, and they all need to happen. I definitely think they all need to happen to have an accountable police force, but none of those sort of technical or legal changes alone is going to fundamentally change the relationship between citizen and state in the way that an abolitionist frame does. So abolition, you know, I'm leaping. You said defund. Now I'm leaping to abolition. But on
it's okay.
Defunding to abolition, it's a utopian project that invites us to imagine a world that feels safe and to think about what it would take us to get us there. But it's also a process of moving from retributive justice to an individualized idea of what justice is. You have an individual who makes a decision to commit a crime, and the response to that is an individual act to put that person in prison. It moves from an individualist frame to a collective and reparative frame for the harm done to communities and to individuals. So you move from an individual sort of civic and political approach to...
Oh no, Rebecca froze. Okay, so Rebecca, we will circle back to you. I promise. You are frozen on my screen. So Atiba, as our communications expert, can you talk about the idea of messaging? So we hear defund the police, and we just heard all these responses that it means different things. And so can you talk about why messaging is so important and why we then have this different response from different communities?
Sure. Okay.
That's okay, Rebecca. I will circle back to you, okay. I promise.
Well, I think overall messaging is important with anything, with any campaign. I don't know if you can fully see my shirt, but it says 2020 effing matters. And it's really interesting how people look at that. And it's really about voting. But people always ask, you know, what does it mean? Who are you with? And so messaging is important. The politics of anything, whether or not it's movies, art, society, all impact us, and how we are able to build coalitions is all contingent on how we build a message. And so when people say, well, the messaging isn't important, I have to disagree, though I think that we have a younger generation that's come along that has been bullied, that has learned how to use shock and awe to get people's attention. I think a term like defund the police may at first be unsettling for some of us who are so accustomed to the police are what protects us, it's what protects our wealth, it's what protects our property. And then you have and then they're among us who have been screaming and shouting and saying, look, to the police, that you have been abusing that power with us. And look at where we are now. A term like defund the police has moved us incredibly further ahead than any of the other messaging that we've used in the past. Police brutality didn't get it, other terms didn't get it. Before I came on today, I made a point to one, look at your book, Keisha, and two, watch Dave Chappelle's 8 minutes and 46 seconds. I think there are some key things that he says in his not even, I call it stand-up, but it wasn't stand-up comedy. And
everybody should watch it.
And one of those things is that he said, I'm comfortable being in the driver's seat. I mean, being in the passenger seat, because these young people and these streets are talking. And so, you know, the message may not be what we would normally put together behind closed doors in a strategy session. The message is taking root with the fact that it's spreading. And this idea, I'll just go real quick, defund the police. I've been working with a candidate here in DC, Janice Lewis George, who's been very big about talking about defund the police. Mm-hmm. Her opposition, the candidate she was running against, the incumbent, there was a special interest group that sent out negative flyers saying that she said she wanted to divest the police. And on those flyers, and it was a fear tactic. It was, she wants to take your jobs. And they wanted her to speak about it. And the recommendation was, don't speak about it. You've already gone on the record of what you say, and your record speaks for itself. She's an assistant attorney general for both Philadelphia and DC. I mention this because there are those that are going to use campaign strategies from the past of invoking fear into people, as opposed to what this campaign of defund the police is about, promoting hope. It's about, we may need to change the name of using the term police. It doesn't mean that we don't need police officers. I remember the police officers in my school, we called them officer friendly. But things have changed, and there are a lot of things in terms of even what we don't want to talk about in the Black community of self-hate that has been put into us as a result, again, going back to slavery, that we've got to keep going back. I'm watching the miniseries Roots for the umpteenth time, and I don't think you can watch it enough times to see the visual imagery of how hate was put into us, how much we called ourselves nigger. And you know, so there's a lot of things in conversations that are going to come across from this that are related to the systemic racism that has been a part of this land for over 400 years.
Yes.
We'll go back to the term as you're asking about defunding the police. Even from a policy standpoint, I think that we've got to figure out ways that, unfortunately, the police are going to have to also bear the burden of this, because too often when we're killed and there's a wrongful death suit, the taxpayer is the one who ends up footing the bill for the wrongful lawsuit.
Right, right.
Some of that needs to be pointed in the direction of pension funds, because if the pension funds are being affected and that's where the money is coming from, you will automatically see a behavioral change of those police officers, the same way we're seeing police officers walking off the job because now they're not protected the way that they used to be, as Rebecca mentioned, qualified immunity.
Right. So we will definitely come back to policies. Rebecca, before you got frozen, you were literally talking about how this messaging from defund the police has gone to abolish the police, or an abolitionist perspective. And so I was wondering how that perspective actually was formed. I know the abolitionist movement with criminal justice and the police existed before, but people are literally talking about different things. So can you sort of finish your thought about how we went from defunding the police to abolish the police, and then also think about messaging from a legal perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I can just reflect how I got here, because I come from this super like legal international perspective, and I learned from abolitionist organizers that I had been working with, largely Black feminist organizers from over-policed communities and from communities where there's a lot of insecurity and there's sort of under-policing and over-policing. So they really thought about security. And I can tell you, I was at a conference last year about abolition of fines and fees in the criminal justice system. Like, this feels like such a technical issue. And by the end of it, we were all like, God, the only way out of this, it's like we're trying to reverse engineer a functioning welfare state out of criminal justice reform. And this is crazy. We're never going to get there. what it would take, we were imagining, is like if in every city and every town in America, every activist got at the municipal budgeting meetings, and then it's like flash forward 6 months, and that's where defund the police is getting us. I think it's incredibly effective. And yeah, there's some space, like it's a spectrum. And as you didn't hear me finish saying that abolition is a utopian project, but it's also very pragmatic and it's iterative, and it's something that people will determine what it means for their community by engaging in participatory budgeting, in community-led safety efforts. So that's what I have to say about that.
Excellent. No, Carlton, you mentioned earlier that police officers have taken this phrase and this message to heart and think they might lose their jobs. But as emotions are running high and what have you, what is the feedback from fellow officers, but also the larger community you live in? I don't want to just single you out as an officer, but you live in the community.
I live in the community that I work. Yes. I first want to just start off by saying, like, I am from Washington, D.C., grew up, D.C. public schools, et cetera, the full enchilada. I also know how it is to be a product of police brutality in PG County in front of my own home. So when we talk about, when we talked about defunding the police, and at first I thought eradicating the police, the reason why I joined the police department was for me to be able to level the playing field. So when I hear messages like that, it automatically reverted back to that situation I was in, and when I was 22, 23 years old. And by me being able to join the department and level the playing field for people that look like me, and just like Ms. Fulton said, being comfortable around me because I'm wearing cornrows or my beard is growing out, or just because of how comfortable I am around my people and I don't view them as a threat. At first, I felt like, wow, this is another way of taking or stripping me away from something. I was stripped away, my humanity was stripped away during that incident in PG County. But then as everybody is starting to talk about allocations and reform and things like that, it's like, okay, you got to step outside of your personal. Like for me, it's not financial, it's not security, because I can, shout out to Ms. Fulton, because I studied environmental science at Lincoln University. And then Atiba, when you were talking about gentrification, it's like everything is just tying in full circle. It's crazy. But it's just one of those things where you just have to take yourself out of the situation and just kind of be the sponge. Like I tell some of my coworkers, yeah, we're down here and people are marching, people are upset, but you got to just take it with a grain of salt. And that's what you have to do, especially if you know people are hurting and people are going through things. And our number one job is to serve and protect. We have to listen to the people. So I love what you said, Atiba, when you said, well, the messaging may be, this and that, but at the end of the day, the message is becoming clear as far as like getting the attention of the people that sit at these tables. Yeah.
Good. All good points, all good points. So Carrie, thinking about space, because that is really what environmental justice is thinking about how we live in certain spaces. When you start thinking about the messaging and the problematic, is it a problematic phrase? I'm getting to the point that it's not anymore because people are literally giving details. But could it be something else specifically linked to the environment, linked to the spaces we live in when we say defund the police? Can we expand it some more?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that defunding police also means reframing how we police our communities. So in the essence, I moved to Baltimore a couple of years ago, and in the neighborhood that I live in, we have these aviation units. And during COVID, for 30 minutes, at 10 o'clock at night, the aviation unit is going around the neighborhood. This is a COVID message. Due to coronavirus, social distancing is necessary. It was completely annoying, and it's a piece of noise pollution. But I thought about that in the sense of like, you were doing all of this in our neighborhood, but what are you doing to track illegal dumping? You could be using that same aviation unit to track whoever is putting all this trash in this neighborhood, because it's not all of our communities, and it's not really handled like that. And even when you think about funding for environmental programs, a lot of times those fundings don't go directly into the communities that are most impacted. They go into general funds. So even if you think about the fund where everybody pays 5 cents for a plastic bag in DC, it goes into a general fund that supports general cleanup of the river, sometimes community education programs, but it does nothing to address the justice and injustice, to really bring justice for communities who have lived on the Anacostia River when it was one of the 10 most polluted rivers in the nation, who were poisoned by that river. It does nothing to deal with people who have eaten toxic fish from that river. So when we rethink how we address the issues in our community, and not from a perspective of criminal justice, let's police, let's put you in this space, we can think about how do we make sure that we're protecting those who are most vulnerable so that they're not placed in these situations. We should be talking about protecting our communities from slumlords who are not doing their part to make sure that homes are healthy. We had a 9-year-old child who died in DC a couple years ago because the landlord and the property wasn't being properly maintained. And there are so many cases like that within public housing, but then especially within private low-income housing that doesn't have to follow the same guidelines as traditional Section 8 or public housing. And I think those are different ways that we can talk about how we reframe the conversation of how we're protecting our communities.
So important. So before we move on to the policy question, I want to just circle back with a question from one of our audience members. So it seems collectively we want to redirect funds away from large police departments and then into some kind of social programs. Rebecca, do you have any sense of where the first place you'd want to see these funds directed?
I mean, don't tell my boss because this isn't what I work on, but it's housing. I would say housing.
Housing, which, yes, reinforces what
issues of security. And when people raise concerns about like, well, what's a different police force or less police force going to look like for intrafamilial violence, for domestic violence, housing is a huge piece of that. It's a huge piece of mental health and behavioral health. So that's the first place I would go.
Yes. Atiba, where would be the first place you'd want funds to be redirected?
Probably, if you don't mind saying, 2 areas. One is training, and the other thing is in terms of the wage inequality. DC, for instance, has $15 minimum wage. It's like that we're going up to. But I think that, you want to address the issues, the core issues of what leads people to crime. It's about when your back is up against the wall, you don't have any other choice but to try to find a way to get money. And, historically over the last 30, maybe plus years, what we've seen in DC was there's a big drug issues that led to murders. And I think that if we started addressing the wage inequality issue, then that would help to address housing, as Rebecca mentioned. It would help a lot of people in terms of their mental health, in terms of what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, trying to just cope. It probably would put some liquor stores out of business, even though people like their little drink or whatever. But I'm saying from the standpoint of a lot of times people are drinking and using drugs just to manage and cope. If you have a better quality of life, I think you'll start to see even health outcomes would change dramatically because people would have money to be able to pay for their prescription drugs, to be able to go to doctors, et cetera. There would be a holistic change. And I think all of it keeps going back to, I keep going back to slavery, but to slavery and this idea of dehumanizing people. And the way you do that is you give them less resources in the way of money. That's what I would like to see, more money in people's pockets.
Yeah, Carlton, I'm coming to you in a moment, but I just want our audience to think about Maslow's hierarchy of need. Before you can actually reach self-actualization, the bottom level is housing, water, clothing, and food. Yeah. Carlton, where would you, if as a police officer, I mean, you mentioned earlier about, investing in more cell phones or technology for police, but where would you like to see funds go to make your job easier even?
Homelessness. And we also talk about education, and it's super important, but it's like we need to talk about the education that matters in this revolving society. And that's like generational wealth. We need to, but that's a whole different topic, but definitely homelessness and mental health, because I'm a crisis intervention officer, and I'm equipped to deal with people with mental health ailments. But sometimes it's like, okay, maybe I will have to go to CPAP like 5 different times during my shift. And maybe the officer next to me has not taken didn't take the training or something like that. But so we need to call mobile crisis, but due to lack of funding and lack of staffing with mobile crisis, they can't come out. So then, so basic like homelessness and mental health. Seriously.
Yep. It's so very, very connected.
It's so connected. It's so
right.
connected.
Carrie, I know you mentioned housing, mental health, but also then the idea of social programs. But could you narrow in on maybe specific programs or specific policy area that you'd like to see funds redirected to?
Yeah, I know we're in the budget process right now, which is critical. And I think there are several different things that could be funded, of course. One of those pieces is around social services, as well as doing the necessary repairs for public housing. We have several different public housing communities that are up for redevelopment or that have been shut down in this process, which means that you're making community members more vulnerable to police brutality and harassment because you're pushing them out into different suburbs that may not be where they have community. So the focus should be on maintaining community as much as possible where they're at. There's a lot of conversations around Build First, which is a policy initiative that when you build public housing or when you redevelop public housing, instead of pushing people into just getting Section 8 vouchers and throwing them everywhere, that you make sure that there is housing available for people in their community, temporary housing if necessary, working with these different condo buildings to make sure that there is adequate, affordable housing is super critical. Those are things that need funding and that have lost funding. Even our school systems have lost funding, and that funding has gone into not only our police departments, but also to build these sports complexes that have played a large role in increasing police presence in our neighborhoods and also increased gentrification, and we can't even use them right now.
Right. That's, yes.
It's a whole soccer stadium, and we spent $150 million of DC taxpayer money to build that soccer stadium, and we can't even use it right now, while people are getting kicked out of the near Buzzard Point community as we speak. So I think those are things that need to be addressed and funded when we talk about this budget for DC.
Definitely. Oh,
Can I?
Yes, it's you.
Just in terms of from the budget standpoint, one, I applaud the mayor in terms of for the political move she made with the Black Lives Matter plaza. But I have serious issues with the fact that we live in a city where illiteracy between African-American kids, Black kids, and white kids is so far wide in between. Or the fact that we have officers who have been involved in murders of young Black men that still is not being resolved. So, you know, when we're looking at all these things that are playing a part here, I just really think, you know, the infant mortality rate of young Black babies, mothers, is one of the highest in the country. That we've got some real strong and serious issues that relate to Black lives really mattering, that go to being part of a systemic problem that we're blaming, you know, in some ways on the police, because yes, this is a huge problem. But we've got to also be effective in terms of advocating and putting in leaders who recognize and hear our voices, which is why I'm wearing this shirt today. Normally I would have put on a dress shirt and a jacket, but because 2020, it really, excuse my language, 2020 fucking matters. It matters so much. And I think that this is a year that's supposed to be about clarity. And, you know, this idea of making America great again, you know, we knew what that meant in the beginning.
Right.
I knew that there was going to be deaths that was going to come as a result. I didn't realize it was going to get this bad or that things would become this destabilized. But what we see around the country, what we see around the world, is this whole thing, this whole idea that together we can make all of this better. And if we, as with this wonderful panel discussion and panelists are doing, you know, is coming together, but we've got to be having some really hard conversations in order to get there.
Yes, so just to summarize this part, and it references a lot of the questions in the question box, but every one of you have really talked about the idea of public safety is plus the physical, plus the social, plus the economic aspect of everybody that may not be wealthy. That's got to be an intersection of lots of things. It's not just mental health and mental ailments. By the way, I'm going to now use ailments instead of illnesses going forward. Carlton, thank you. But it's the idea of taking multiple things, because addressing mental ailments in one way does not mean they've got a safe place to go sleep. Right. So there's an intervention that doesn't then just get carried forward. So we really do have to think about systems change, that the systems talk to each other. And so this leads us to our final question. And thank you, audience members, for your great questions. I'm trying to summarize them and at least get to some of them. But I'd really like our panelists to talk about policy changes. So Rebecca, what do you think are some real policy changes that we could address? You mentioned some earlier, like qualified immunity. We need
qualified immunity. I mean, in the like classic like canon of things that we need to do to increase police accountability, it's a little bit simpler. I mean, I think that the tension in terms of the defund message is that a lot of things that are called reform and have been implemented as reforms have not functioned to restrain police violence. They haven't worked, and they particularly haven't worked where it's been things like training and moves to community police that just move money around and move bodies around, and just actually plow more money into a failing and violent system. So I mean, I do think it's really important to take on the defund message as a structural answer, but yeah, qualified immunity. We need to have more transparency for disciplinary records of police, and changes to what discipline looks like for police, how permanent it is, the role of the union, and then.
Sorry, Rebecca, about, no, this is really helpful for people to think through, is when you start thinking about transparency and punishment of police, is that a union issue? Or is that a legal?
I mean, it's both. It's
okay.
Both. But I prefer to think about it. I think it's more fruitful actually to think about the labor element of it, because I lean toward abolitionism, and I don't think that the answer is prosecuting finding the bad cops, prosecuting them, getting rid of them, and then you're left with good cops. I think it's systematic, and it's in cultures, in professional cultures, and those are set up, and people are incentivized to act in certain ways. I apply my abolitionist lens as well to police discipline. But if people know about who police are, if it affects their pensions, if we know about how they can be reinstated, can they go and work at another police force next door, then you're not really seeing accountability, and police aren't really feeling it when they break the law.
Right. So Carlton, on these policy issues, how do you think the union would receive some of these so-called reforms and changes? But also, what do you think are the best ways of moving forward?
Yes, I think when we talk about reform, I think it should be some type of representative or some type of voice from police departments so they actually know what's going on at these discussions, because it'll be times where, let's say for an example, I don't agree with police brutality. I'm a product of it. I can't relate to someone else, so I don't really like being paired with. You know, that's like somebody stereotyping the color of my skin. Like, that's what I've had peeves. But I think it should be also some type of representation should be at those seats so we can actually talk about it. But as we talk about reform, because I think about this a lot, I think it should be like a federal regulation on police departments across the country that hold like this one entity that's holding all police entities to this one standard. Like we have Department of Health who holds certain restaurants or all restaurants to a certain health standard. I think that is super important. I think it's super important that we tackle our neighborhoods that we're most afraid to go into. And that's our Ward 8s, our Ward 7s in Washington, D.C., our Ward 6, you know, our neighborhoods that are experiencing food deserts, lack of resources, lack of education, lack of resources, as you will, and build and figure out how could we mend that relationship and work through that trauma, because there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of trauma that a lot of people go through, especially with the police. So we need to focus on those relationships.
Carlton, how do you think we can facilitate those relationships between the community and the police with the community?
I think it needs to be more presence outside of a work and outside of a work capacity. You know, like let's say MPD has an ice cream social. That's really cool and cute and all, and they'll be in like Connecticut Avenue. No, we need to be on Martin Luther King Avenue. We need to be supporting community functions and things like that, not in a capacity where we have to feel like we need to wear our weapons, but we just need to show presence. We need more people living in these communities. But it's also hard because then we talk about like the price of DC increases, blah, 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 but that is needed. We need more officers that look like the people that they're working with or policing. We need that. That's super imperative, super important. We need officers that are not afraid to build these relationships and understand that you're going to get pushback and blowback and you're going to get curved. People are going to say whatever they want to say, but at the end of the day, it's because of trauma and what they went through. And people are not afraid to try to break those barriers, because if you continue to try to work towards those relationships, then you'll see change, in my opinion.
Thank you. Carrie, please share what you think are some policy suggestions or changes that need to be implemented, discussed.
I think it's also critical what Carlton mentioned around our community anchors, like our teachers, our police, our fire departments, living where we are at in our communities is super critical. And there were some initiatives to make sure that they put mortgage support and other programs for officers and for other government employees. There are also initiatives that put extra points if you're a DC resident and apply for DC government jobs. Now, here's the problem with that. You have a lot of transitioning happening in DC. So now you have people who are getting these jobs, they're getting those extra points, but they don't have the lived experience and knowledge of Washington, DC that would make you a good and emotionally intelligent police officer. And I saw that same thing happen within public schools here in DC, where I remember when Fenty was in office and they drastically changed our school system. What happened was that you had a lot of younger teachers come in who didn't have the experience with certain students who didn't know the neighborhood. So it took schools from being really neighborhood institutions into something that was more charter school, and every 4 years something's changing. I'm also very concerned that we have to make sure when we write these policies that it doesn't create loopholes for private institutions to come in and add funding to the police, because private institutions do not have to follow the same guidelines as public. So that's important as well.
Right. We have to really think about any reforms going forward. You got to think about the counter argument, but also the implementation and the impact of those potential new policies. Are we just creating new problems? I personally don't want to totally abolish and defund the police. They definitely serve a role in society. I would just like to change how police and the community interact. Because if we really do abolish police departments, we will then have private security, which gets to Carrie's point, and less regulations and less transparency. And we don't want the privatization of police departments, because then that totally changes the relationship again. Atiba, we're running out of time, so I'm going to give you the last word on what do you think are the policy and non-policy options that we can do to improve our community relations and dismantle some of these barriers and really address systematic racism. It's not a small question.
Carlton said, and that was in terms of having police officers involved in this process. And I have to say, I disagree with that. I think that first off, we've got to remove the police from that conversation. This has to be a community-centered conversation, because the role of the police is to protect and to serve the community. And too often, the community is the one that is being affected by the role of the police officers. I mean, even right here in DC, with the blue lights on the police cars are going along all the time. And I know that that came from a trip to Israel years ago, saying, well, this was what they used to fight against terrorism. Well, right here, what it does is, all it does is heighten tensions. So we've got to be finding ways that are going to first de-escalate the tensions, because when we have a protest, a peaceful protest, and you put militarized police officers in the mix of that with a mindset of, you know, law and order, then that is leading to creating more tension as opposed to de-escalating the tension. When you look at cities like Philadelphia that are now defunded, you look at Camden, you look at Minneapolis that is disbanded, I think that what we're going to have to do in terms of the policy pieces now is look at some of these other places and say, because some of this is going to be successful and some of it is not. And we're going to have to be looking at what that is and then trying to try to fix those problems. From an overall policy point, I personally think that we've got to make some real changes. I think Carrie hit on some really a big piece earlier when she talked about when she moved to DC, and that how she felt that there was a police force in a city that was predominantly African American that had a predominant African American police force. Personally, this is just my take, the last 3 mayors have had a white police chief in a city that is still, though slightly, majority African American. We have a police force that it looks very much to me, I don't know the numbers, but it looks like it is a very white police force. And I think that we've got to really address that. And I'll say this, and speaking as Carlton, really appreciate you being here as a police officer and telling some of your story about why you became a police officer. But I every day where I live, I hear Vice President Pence's car coming past my place every day. So I hear police sirens. I go out to run or to walk along the river. I see the police that are out there. I speak to police officers all the time, whether or not I'm in a grocery store, walking on the street. I can only imagine the tension of what it must be like to be a police officer. I remember one telling me that his job was hours of boredom and moments of terror. That's got to be a big mental health issue right there. So I think there has to be psychological ongoing training or services for police officers. But when I speak to a police officer and they look me right in the eye and they don't speak, and I do this and I can say out of 100 police officers, maybe 2 speak back, whether or not they're African American or white. The fact that I live in a city that has so many different police entities, whether or not it's Metropolitan Police, Capitol Police, U.S. Park Service, Secret Service, FBI, and the list goes on, that I live in a city that is under a police state. We don't say it, but that's what it is. And until we really start to address that part, until we start looking and saying we need to have police officers in our communities that look like us, that are walking the beat and walking and getting to know people and not just sitting in a car waiting for something to happen, then systemically this is not going to change. And if that means defunding and disbanding the police in order to have a better system of policies that puts police officers, one, in the best position to protect and to serve our communities, but to serve the people who are in the communities, not to serve the wealthy interest or whatever of what historically slave patrols were about, which has then become what police officers have been about.
Right.
Thank you. There are a lot of things we got to address from that standpoint.
Thank you so much. Rebecca, do you have any final comments? And then I'll come back to Carrie and Carlton.
I just wanted to say that this is a very local conversation. Like these questions about what safety means and how to achieve it. Really, I mean, I take your point, Carlton. I have often like advocated for national institutions and standards to apply to police in the U.S. So I think there's definitely a role for that. But these questions about what safety means and how we get there are really locally contingent, and it's going to look a little different place to place based on the kinds of conflicts that people are having, the struggles they have, the resources that community has, the history they have, and I think that we have to, as a community, develop some tolerance for that, not be expecting easy answers all tied up, and not to let that reduce our what's it called when you stick with something, our like resilience within the movement, to stay with it. It's going to get hard, it's going to get messy, and it's going to look a little different place to place, but not to let that dissuade us from staying in this.
It's a great message. Thank you. Carrie? Final words.
I think it's just really important, and really Google Elijah McClain. I'm gonna post up his story on my Instagram, follow Check the Weather. But it's so important because, you know, when I think about his story, he was a really soft and gentle person. He was a vegan. So when we think about those environmental issues, and he wasn't resisting arrests, he wasn't doing any of those things. He was in his own neighborhood, and he was still killed by the police. And when we think about how we want to reframe, we should be thinking about people like Elijah McClain, who should be able to live their lives and be weird and be introverted like a lot of us are, and still not be seen as a threat or a target. And that's the future that we can believe in. So check the weather. There you go.
Thank you, Carlton.
And I just like to say that that's why I like discussions like this, because we're all different and we all have our own perspective. We all been through certain things. We all have reasoning for things. And that's what makes things like this necessary and unique, no matter how difficult someone's response may be or the topic may be. I think it's super important. For me, my standpoint and my position will always be like, I'm always going to be in my community. I'm from Washington, D.C., went to school here, work here, live here, and I am community. I am community whether I have my uniform on or not. I want to be a part of the discussion. I'm going to be a part of the discussion. And my thing is infiltrating these systems until we can get to a place of utopia and everything is perfect. Until we get to that point, we just really have to infiltrate these systems, get more people that look like us, that value like us. Let's go from an enforcement standpoint to more of a humanitarian standpoint. And we need to do that by encouraging our people to want to be a part of these systems, whether it's a police officer, a lawyer, a judge, on a federal level, et cetera. I just would like to thank everybody for their message, and let's continue to fight for what we need to fight for. Indeed.
Atiba.
No, I want to thank everyone who's been on the panel. Thank you, Keisha, for moderating this. Thank GovHub for putting this together, and the audience. And I just would leave this one last thing from a policy standpoint. I think we're trying to get there, but it would be great to have a database where every officer that has fired their weapon, every officer that has killed someone, that is in a database, and that it is accessible to the public, so that we'll all be aware of these officers that are, and hopefully make it harder for police departments to rehire officers that have a record of abusing their power.
Indeed. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to Opengov Hub for hosting us. This was a great conversation. Thank you to the participants. My apologies, I did not get to all your questions, but I really do appreciate your willingness to stay on and engage and at least listen. I hope you take some of these issues and talk to your friends, your family, other people in the community, your neighbors, to just share with them your perspective and continue this conversation. And more importantly is, to Atiba's t-shirt, 2020 matters. It really does effing matter. So register to vote. If you missed the primaries, that is okay. You have the time to register for the November 3rd elections. This is not just about the presidency, though it takes up a lot of volume. It's not just about control of the United States Congress, the House, and the Senate, but it's also local elections. It's your state legislators. In 2021, they will be drawing new districts for representation in all these elected bodies. We need to elect individuals that care about all these issues, and it matters then to vote in local elections. Just because the presidency and the control of the United States Congress is going to take up a lot of media, energy, and oxygen, really do look at who's running for prosecutor in your city, who is running for county district attorney, who is running for mayor, who is running for city council, who's going to be on your school board, who are your state elected officials. Yes, it takes time, but get to Google and start looking at who is running for local offices from the governor down, because those laws are actually going to implement or affect you more than what Congress will or will not do. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time and energy. Stay safe, wear a mask when you go outside. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was great.
So amazing. Oh.
You all have a blessed one. It was lovely being on a panel with
I
y'all.
appreciate you all.
Indeed.
Oh my gosh.
Stay in touch, y'all.
Will do. All right, guys.